April 1945. The limestone caves of southern Okinawa. In the suffocating darkness, a young woman named Kimiko Tanaka pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her uniform torn and stained with coral dust. Above her, the earth trembled with the thunder of American artillery. For 3 weeks she had not seen daylight. For 3 weeks she had eaten nothing but a handful of dried sweet potato and rainwater collected in her helmet. The Imperial Japanese Army's Haimuri Student Corps, 222 schoolgirls turned battlefield nurses, had been told they would die with honor before they would ever surrender to the barbarous Americans. Now, crouching in that cave with 17 other young women, Kimiko clutched a single-hand grenade to her chest. Her instructions were clear. When the Americans came, she would pull the pin. Death before dishonor. Death before the unspeakable fate that awaited any Japanese woman who fell into enemy hands. Outside, boots crunched on volcanic rock, American voices low and cautious. Kimiko's fingers tightened on the grenade. This was the moment she had been trained for since she was 15 years old. This was the culmination of every lesson, every drill, every warning. The Americans were coming, and with them, everything she had been taught to fear. The Battle of Okinawa was not merely a military campaign. It was a collision of ideologies so fundamental that neither side initially understood they were fighting different wars entirely. From April through June 1945, the island became the bloodiest theater of the Pacific War, claiming over 200,000 lives. But what made Okinawa uniquely devastating was not simply the scale of casualties. It was the fact that Japanese military doctrine, civilian indoctrination, and cultural conditioning had created a population convinced that capture by American forces meant something worse than death. The Japanese government, through years of systematic propaganda, had built an elaborate mythology of American brutality. Schoolchildren were taught that American soldiers were demons who would rape, torture, and mutilate any Japanese they captured. Women were specifically instructed that sexual violation was not merely probable but guaranteed, and that the torture would be so severe that death, even suicide, was preferable to the alternative. This was not accidental. The Japanese military leadership understood that surrender might become tempting as the war turned catastrophic. They needed their population to fear capture more than they feared death, and so they manufactured terror. Newsreels showed fabricated atrocities. Radio broadcasts described in graphic detail the supposed fates of prisoners. Teachers in schools conducted drills where students practiced ritual suicide rather than capture. By the time American forces landed on Okinawa, the psychological conditioning was complete. Women serving in auxiliary military roles, nurses, communications operators, supply clerks, carried cyanide capsules or grenades not as last resort weapons, but as tools of escape from the inevitable horror of American capture. Kimiko Tanaka had believed every word. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher in Naha. In 1944, her entire class had been mobilized into the Haimuri Student Corps, transformed overnight from schoolgirls into military nurses. They were given rudimentary medical training, handed uniforms, and deployed to field hospitals behind the Japanese defensive lines. When the Americans invaded Okinawa on April 1, 1945, Kimiko and her classmates found themselves in a nightmare beyond anything their training had prepared them for. The wounded came in endless waves, men with limbs torn away by naval gunfire, faces burned beyond recognition by flamethrowers, intestines spilling from shrapnel wounds. The field hospitals were caves carved into the limestone cliffs, without electricity, without proper surgical equipment, without enough anesthesia. The girls worked by candlelight, amputating limbs with hacksaws, trying to pack abdominal wounds with strips of cloth torn from their own uniforms. Many had never seen blood before. Now they waded through it. As the American forces advanced south, the hospitals were repeatedly overrun. The Haimuri Corps retreated deeper into the cave networks, dragging wounded soldiers who could be moved, leaving behind those who could not. Kimiko watched girls she had known since childhood die from starvation, disease, and American bombardment. By late June, when the American forces finally surrounded the southern caves, fewer than half of the 222 girls remained alive. Those who survived faced what they believed would be a fate worse than the death they had already witnessed. They had been told, repeatedly and explicitly, what American soldiers did to Japanese women. Now those soldiers were standing outside the cave entrance, calling in broken Japanese for them to come out. Kimiko made her decision. She would not go out. She would pull the pin on the grenade, close her eyes, and die with the honor her country demanded. Her fingers found the metal ring. She began to pull. Then a strange thing happened. A canteen came rolling into the cave, bouncing across the uneven stone floor. Then another. Then a chocolate bar wrapped in brown paper. Then a small white package that Kimiko later learned was called a K-ration. The American voices called out again, gentler this time. Not threatening, almost apologetic. Kimiko stared at the chocolate bar lying 3 feet from her position. She had not seen chocolate in 2 years. She had not seen food of any kind in 3 weeks. The grenade suddenly felt very heavy in her hands. The surrender, when it finally came, was not what Kimiko expected. She expected violence. She expected to be dragged from the cave by her hair, stripped and violated while her companions watched. She expected torture, mutilation, perhaps death if she was lucky. What she got instead was a 19-year-old Marine from Kansas City named Thomas Chen, whose parents had emigrated from Canton in 1920, speaking to her in careful, accented Japanese. He was crouched at the cave entrance, his rifle slung across his back, both hands raised and empty. Behind him, 3 other Marines stood with their weapons pointed at the ground. "Please," Chen said in Japanese, "you are injured. We have medical supplies, we have food. No one will hurt you. I promise you on my honor no one will hurt you." Kimiko looked at the other girls huddled in the darkness. Some were crying. One was unconscious from infected wounds. Another was delirious with fever. They were dying in this cave, slowly and painfully. Kimiko made the second hardest decision of her life. She set down the grenade, raised her hands above her head, and crawled toward the light. The moment she emerged into the sunlight, Kimiko Tanaka's understanding of reality began to fracture. The Americans did not strike her. They did not tear at her clothing. Instead, a medic, a woman, an American woman in military uniform, immediately came forward with a medical kit. She examined Kimiko's infected leg wound with professional efficiency, cleaned it with stinging antiseptic, and wrapped it in clean white bandages that smelled of something astringent and chemical. Another soldier handed her a canteen of water, cold and pure, more water than Kimiko had drunk in weeks. She drank until she choked, then drank more. The American woman medic said something in English. Thomas Chen translated. "She says you need to drink slowly or you will be sick. She says you are severely dehydrated and malnourished. She wants to know when you last ate." Kimiko stared at them. This was wrong. This was all wrong. These were supposed to be demons. These were supposed to be rapists and murderers. But the woman medic was looking at her with something that looked almost like concern. Kimiko's mind could not reconcile what she had been taught with what was happening in front of her eyes. She began to cry, not from fear but from the cognitive dissonance of her collapsing worldview. Over the next 3 hours, 17 more girls emerged from that cave. Not one was harmed. Not one was threatened. Each was given water, food, and medical attention. Those who could walk were helped to a collection point. Those who could not were carried on stretchers by American soldiers who moved with surprising gentleness. By nightfall, Kimiko and her surviving companions found themselves in a U.S. Army field hospital, a vast complex of canvas tents with electric lights, surgical theaters, X-ray machines, and supplies that seemed impossibly abundant. Clean sheets, real beds, hot food, nurses who spoke to them kindly, who changed their bandages, who brought them soup and bread and sometimes, miraculously, ice cream. This was not what Kimiko had expected. This was not what any of them had expected. and the cognitive shock of that realization was, in its own way, almost as traumatic as the battle they had just survived. The treatment of Japanese female prisoners of war by American forces during the Pacific Campaign represents one of the most significant and least discussed ideological victories of the war. It was not simply a matter of humane treatment, though that was radical enough given the propaganda both sides had been fed. It was a systematic demonstration of a worldview so fundamentally different from Japanese military culture that many prisoners initially could not process what they were experiencing. The contrast was not merely between cruelty and kindness. It was between two completely different conceptions of what human beings owed to one another, even in war. Japanese military culture in World War II was built on a foundation of Bushido, the warrior code that emphasized absolute loyalty, ritual honor, and contempt for surrender. But the version of Bushido taught to Japanese soldiers and civilians during the war was a distorted, militarized interpretation that bore only superficial resemblance to historical samurai ethics. This modern Bushido taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, that death was always preferable to capture, and that enemy prisoners were beneath contempt because they had chosen dishonor over death. Japanese soldiers were taught to view Allied prisoners with genuine disdain, not simply as enemies, but as moral failures, men and women who had revealed their fundamental weakness by choosing to live rather than die with honor. This ideology had practical consequences. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners during the war was notoriously brutal, resulting in death rates of approximately 27% for POWs in Japanese custody, compared to 4% for POWs in German custody. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the countless atrocities documented at camps throughout the Japanese Empire. These were not aberrations but logical extensions of an ideology that viewed prisoners as subhuman precisely because they had surrendered. If your own soldiers would rather die than surrender, and you teach them that surrender reveals moral failure, then enemy prisoners become not victims of war but willing participants in their own degradation. American military culture, by contrast, was built on a fundamentally different foundation. U.S. military doctrine emphasized pragmatism over ritual honor. American soldiers were taught that surrender in impossible situations was not dishonorable but practical. The U.S. Military Code of Conduct, formalized in the years after World War II, but reflecting values already present, explicitly stated that soldiers should evade capture if possible, but that surrender was acceptable when further resistance became futile. This practical approach to warfare meant that Americans viewed enemy prisoners not as moral failures, but as defeated combatants who retained their basic human rights even in captivity. But beyond military doctrine, American treatment of prisoners reflected something deeper, a democratic ideology that insisted on the inherent dignity of every individual regardless of circumstances. This was not merely sentiment. It was codified in the Geneva Conventions, which the United States had signed and actually attempted to follow, unlike Japan, which had signed but explicitly rejected applying to its own conduct. American military leadership understood that how you treated prisoners revealed what you were fighting for. If the United States claimed to fight for human dignity, freedom, and democracy, then treating prisoners humanely was not optional. It was the war made visible. For Japanese women like Kimiko Tanaka, this ideological difference became real in the most mundane ways. It was not grand speeches or dramatic gestures that shattered their indoctrination. It was the accumulated weight of small kindnesses repeated daily until the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. The food was the first crack in the wall. In the POW camp at Camp Hagushi, established on the western coast of Okinawa in May 1945, Japanese female prisoners received the same rations as American soldiers. This was not generosity, it was policy. Geneva Convention standards required that prisoners receive rations equal to those of the capturing power's own troops. But for women who had been starving in caves, eating tree bark and insects, the American military diet seemed impossibly luxurious. Canned meat, fresh bread, powdered milk, coffee, sugar, chocolate. The sheer abundance was incomprehensible. Kimiko, in testimony recorded decades later, described her first full meal in American custody. They gave us a metal tray divided into sections, and in each section was food, real food. Meat that I think was beef, though it came from a can. Potatoes mashed and mixed with butter. Green beans. Bread, white bread, soft and fresh. And a small paper cup with fruit that had been preserved in sweet syrup. I stared at this tray for several minutes. I thought perhaps it was some kind of trick, that they were fattening us for something worse. But the American soldiers were eating the same food. I watched them. They ate casually, as if this abundance was normal. Some of them even complained about the food. I could not understand this. I could not understand a country where soldiers complained about having too much food. The psychological impact of this abundance cannot be overstated. Japanese propaganda had spent years telling civilians that America was a weak, decadent nation on the verge of collapse. They had been told that American soldiers were soft, pampered, and cowardly. They had been shown photographs, carefully selected and often fabricated, of American breadlines, poverty, and deprivation. The message was clear. Japan, despite its smaller size, was spiritually stronger, more disciplined, more united. America was a crumbling empire held together by money and machinery, already defeated by its own moral weakness. But the evidence in front of Kimiko told a different story. These Americans did not look like a defeated people. They looked healthy, well-fed, and casually confident. They moved with the efficiency of people who expected things to work. They had equipment that seemed both abundant and disposable. When something broke, they simply got another. They wasted nothing but worried about nothing. Where Japanese soldiers had been taught to endure hardship as a virtue, American soldiers seemed to view hardship as a problem to be solved with better logistics. The symbolic power of this abundance was enormous. Every meal became a small refutation of Japanese propaganda. Every clean bandage, every dose of penicillin, every bar of soap demonstrated that America was not weak, not failing, not on the verge of collapse. These women had been told they were fighting for a strong nation against a weak one. Now they were living inside the evidence that they had been lied to. But food was only the beginning. The real transformation came from something more fundamental, the way American soldiers treated them as human beings rather than objects of contempt. In Japanese military culture, a woman who had been captured was assumed to be sexually available, either by choice or by circumstance. The comfort women system, which forced hundreds of thousands of women into sexual slavery for the Japanese military, was built on this assumption. Women who lost male protection lost their honor, and women without honor could be used however men saw fit. This was not secret. It was understood. Japanese female military personnel knew, with cold certainty, that if they fell into enemy hands, especially American hands, they would be raped, repeatedly, brutally, as a matter of course. Kimiko and the other Haimuri survivors spent their first nights in American custody sleeping in rigid terror, waiting for the inevitable assault. It did not come, not the first night, not the second, not the third. The women were housed in a separate section of the camp, guarded by American military police whose orders were explicit and enforced. No unauthorized contact with female prisoners. Any soldier who entered the women's section without proper authorization and escort faced court-martial. This was not policy in theory. It was policy in practice, enforced with military discipline. The American military leadership understood, with pragmatic clarity, that how they treated female prisoners would determine whether other women surrendered or fought to the death. Every rape, every assault, every harassment would be reported back through whatever communication networks remained. It would confirm everything Japanese propaganda had said. It would guarantee that tens of thousands of women would choose suicide over surrender, would kill themselves rather than face capture. The Americans could not afford that, morally or strategically, and so the orders were clear and the enforcement was real. But beyond strategy, there was something else at work, something cultural and ideological that Japanese women found almost impossible to process. Many of the American soldiers, particularly those from religious backgrounds, genuinely believed that women should be protected, not as property, not as rewards, but as human beings with inherent dignity that remained intact regardless of circumstances. This was not universal. There were American soldiers who would have behaved differently without strict orders and enforcement. But the ideology was widespread enough to be real, visible, and utterly foreign to what these women had been taught about American men. Fumiko Nakamura, another Haimyuri survivor, described her confusion in testimony recorded in 1982. There was an American soldier who guarded our section. He was very young, perhaps 20. He had red hair and his face turned red when the sun touched it. Every morning he would bring us water and say good morning in Japanese. He practiced saying it correctly. After a few days, one of the other girls asked him, through the interpreter, why he was kind to us. He looked confused by the question. He said through the interpreter, "You are girls, you are far from home, you are hurt, of course we are kind to you." This answer made no sense to us. We were the enemy. We had served the Japanese military. We had tried to kill Americans. Why would he be kind to us? But he was. Every day he brought water and said good morning, and his face turned red in the sun, and he was kind. It broke something inside of me. I realized that I had been taught to see Americans as monsters, and this boy with red hair was not a monster. He was just a boy. And if he was not a monster, then what else had I been taught that was a lie? The answer, as these women gradually discovered, was everything. Nearly everything they had been taught about America, Americans, and the war itself had been either distorted or fabricated. The process of discovering this was not liberating. It was devastating. Their entire understanding of reality was built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath them. The medical care was perhaps the most visceral demonstration of this different worldview. The Haimyuri nurses had worked in Japanese field hospitals, where the standards of care were brutal by necessity and ideology. Wounded soldiers were expected to endure pain without complaint. Anesthesia was scarce and often reserved for officers. Amputations were performed with minimal pain relief, and soldiers were expected to demonstrate spiritual strength through stoic silence. The idea was that physical pain was temporary, but spiritual weakness was permanent. A man who cried out during surgery revealed character flaws that no amount of physical healing could fix. American military medicine operated on completely different principles. Pain relief was not a luxury but a medical necessity. Anesthesia was used liberally. Wounded soldiers were encouraged to request pain medication if they needed it, and doctors prescribed it without moral judgment. The goal was healing, not character testing. Suffering was viewed as something to be minimized, not endured. When the Haimyuri survivors were treated for their own injuries, infected wounds, malnutrition, dysentery, tropical diseases, they received the same medical care as American soldiers. Penicillin, still relatively new and valuable, was administered to Japanese prisoners with the same protocols used for U.S. personnel. Kimiko's infected leg wound, which would almost certainly have required amputation or resulted in fatal sepsis under Japanese military medicine, was cleaned, debrided, treated with antibiotics, and healed completely within 6 weeks. She was given morphine for the pain during the worst of it. A nurse checked on her every few hours. A doctor examined the wound daily, adjusted her treatment, and explained in careful, translated Japanese what they were doing and why. This level of medical attention for an enemy combatant was, by Japanese standards, incomprehensible. It violated every understanding of how war worked, how resources should be allocated, how enemies should be treated. Japanese military doctrine held that resources should go to those who could return to combat. Wounded soldiers who could not recover quickly were often given minimal care or encouraged to commit suicide rather than consume precious medical supplies. The idea of using valuable antibiotics on an enemy prisoner, on a woman, no less, who could never return to combat, was so foreign to Japanese military logic that many of the women initially believed there must be a sinister motive behind it. But there was no sinister motive. There was only a different ideology. American military medicine, influenced by both Geneva Convention requirements and democratic values, treated healing as a moral obligation regardless of nationality or military utility. You healed wounded prisoners for the same reason you healed your own soldiers, because they were human beings in pain, and you had the means to help them. This was not sentimentality. It was policy, backed by resources, training, and enforcement. The transformation this caused in the women prisoners was gradual but irreversible. You could not receive that level of care, that level of attention, that level of basic human respect, and continue believing that the people providing it were demons. The cognitive dissonance became too great. Something had to give. And what gave, slowly and painfully, was their faith in everything they had been taught by their own government. By August 1945, the POW camp at Okinawa held over 4,000 Japanese female prisoners, nurses, communications operators, supply clerks, civilian volunteers who had been mobilized into military service. The camp had become a strange liminal space where two ideologies collided in slow motion. The American military authorities ran the camp with typical bureaucratic efficiency: roll calls, work assignments, medical inspections, recreation periods. The women were given tasks, laundry, cooking, camp maintenance, that kept them occupied and useful. They were paid small amounts in scrip that could be used at the camp commissary for toiletries, writing paper, and small luxuries. They were allowed to write censored letters home. They were shown American movies on a makeshift outdoor screen, films that depicted an America of abundance, diversity, and casual freedom that seemed like propaganda but was, they slowly realized, largely real. The cultural shock went both ways. The American soldiers and administrators running the camp were often as confused by the Japanese women as the women were by them. The women's terror of surrender, their initial refusal to accept that they would not be raped or killed, their profound shame at still being alive. These reactions baffled Americans who had grown up with different values about survival and honor. Marine Corps interpreters like Thomas Chen, who understood both cultures, found themselves trying to bridge an ideological gap so wide that sometimes translation was impossible. Chen, in an oral history recorded in 1987, described his role. "I was translating words, but I was also translating entire worldviews. When a Japanese woman asked me why the Americans were being kind to them, I could translate the question easily. But explaining the answer was almost impossible. How do you explain American individualism, democratic values, and Geneva Convention law to someone who has been raised in a culture of absolute hierarchy and collective identity? How do you explain that Americans think all people have inherent rights regardless of their circumstances? There wasn't even vocabulary in Japanese for some of these concepts. I had to invent translations, and even then, I could see the confusion in their eyes. They understood my words, but they could not make those words fit into their understanding of how the world worked." But gradually, through accumulated small experiences, the women began to build a new understanding. It happened in pieces. A conversation with a female American nurse who talked about her life before the war. She had been a schoolteacher in Minnesota. She missed her family. She was tired of the war but believed in the cause. The revelation that American women had jobs, opinions, and a degree of autonomy that was unthinkable in pre-war Japan. The discovery that American soldiers came from astonishingly diverse backgrounds, not just different regions but different ethnicities, religions, and social classes, and yet functioned as a coherent military unit. The gradual realization that American democracy, which Japanese propaganda had portrayed as weak and chaotic, somehow produced soldiers who were disciplined, effective, and strangely idealistic about what they were fighting for. One recurring symbol helped crystallize this transformation: chewing gum. It appeared everywhere in American military life. Soldiers chewed it casually, constantly, almost unconsciously. They offered it to each other, to local civilians, to prisoners. It was cheap, abundant, and ubiquitous. To the Japanese women, this gum became a perfect symbol of American excess and casual generosity. It served no purpose except pleasure. It was thrown away after use. It was given away freely to anyone, including enemies. It represented a worldview where resources were so abundant that waste was acceptable, where even prisoners could be given small luxuries for no reason except kindness. Kimiko remembered. A soldier gave me chewing gum in September. I did not know what it was. He mimed chewing and I understood. I put it in my mouth and chewed. It was sweet and minty and strange. I chewed for maybe 20 minutes and then I did not know what to do with it. I thought perhaps I should swallow it, but the soldier laughed, not unkindly, and mimed spitting it out. So I spit it into paper and threw it away. I threw it away. This tiny piece of sweetness, this small pleasure, I simply threw it away because it had no more use. This seemed to me the most American thing I had ever done. In Japan, we had been taught to waste nothing, to endure without complaint, to find virtue in deprivation. Americans threw away chewing gum. Both worldviews could not be right. I chose the chewing gum. That choice, repeated by thousands of women in similar circumstances, had profound implications that extended far beyond the war itself. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, the women in the Okinawa POW camp faced a new crisis of identity. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were simply Japanese civilians in a country that had been utterly defeated, occupied by the same Americans who had been feeding them, healing them, and treating them with bewildering kindness for months. The question became, who were they now? How did they return to a Japanese society that had been built on the ideologies they had just watched collapse? How did they explain to families and neighbors that the Americans were not demons, that surrender was not the ultimate shame, that everything they had been taught was wrong? Many of them could not. The psychological burden of that knowledge was too great. Some of the Haimyuri survivors committed suicide in the years after the war, not because of trauma from battle, but because of the impossible cognitive dissonance of their position. They had survived when they were supposed to die. They had been treated kindly by enemies who were supposed to be monsters. They carried knowledge that contradicted everything their society believed. That burden, for some, was heavier than any physical wound. But others became witnesses. They spoke, wrote, and testified about their experiences. They became living refutations of the propaganda that had nearly killed them. In the decades after the war, survivors like Kimiko Tanaka and Fumiko Nakamura gave lectures at schools, participated in oral history projects, and worked to ensure that younger generations understood what they had learned at such terrible cost. That propaganda works by dehumanizing enemies, that ideologies built on lies will eventually collide with reality, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply treating other human beings with basic dignity. The U.S. military's treatment of Japanese female POWs was not perfect. There were incidents of harassment, violations of protocol, and failures of enforcement. American military leadership was motivated by strategic considerations as much as moral ones. The policy of humane treatment was pragmatic, designed to encourage surrender and reduce casualties, not purely altruistic. But within those limitations, something remarkable happened. A military force, in the middle of the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, managed to treat enemy combatants with enough basic humanity to shatter years of indoctrination. This was not an accident. It required planning, resources, training, and most importantly, a consistent ideology that valued human dignity even in the midst of total war. American soldiers had to be taught that protecting prisoners was not optional but mandatory. Medical personnel had to treat enemy wounded with the same protocols as friendly forces. Camp administrators had to maintain standards that seemed wasteful in wartime but were essential to what America claimed to represent. The chewing gum, the chocolate bars, the clean bandages, the morphine, the small kindnesses, these were not trivial details. They were democracy made visible. They were the ideology made real in the most brutal circumstances imaginable. For women like Kimiko Tanaka, that ideology was literally life-saving. Without it, she and thousands of others would have died in those caves, grenades clutched to their chests, faithful to a lie until the end. The fact that they lived, that they surrendered, that they experienced an alternative to what they had been taught, this was not a side effect of American military policy. It was the point. It was what distinguished the United States from its enemies, what justified the massive sacrifice of American lives, what made the war about something larger than territory or revenge. By 1950, Kimiko Tanaka had returned to Okinawa, where she became a teacher. She taught history to children born after the war, children who did not remember the lies. She told them about the caves, about the grenades, about the moment she almost pulled the pin. And then she told them about the canteen that rolled into the darkness, about the chocolate bar, about Thomas Chen with his careful Japanese and his empty hands. She told them about the choice she made and what happened after. She told them that ideology matters, that how you treat people matters, that small kindnesses in terrible circumstances can shatter worldviews built on years of lies. She kept one object from those days, not as a museum piece but as a reminder. It was a wrapper from a Hershey's chocolate bar, brown paper with silver lettering, given to her by a Marine from Kansas on a night in 1945 when she thought the world had ended. She kept it in a small wooden box on her desk, and sometimes, when teaching about the war, she would take it out and show it to her students. "This," she would tell them, "is what democracy looks like. Not a flag or a speech or a constitution. This, a piece of chocolate given to an enemy by a soldier who could have killed her instead. Remember this. Remember that human dignity is not something you talk about. It is something you do, even when it is difficult, even when it is inconvenient, even when the person you are helping tried to kill you yesterday. Especially then. That is what makes us human. That is what makes us free." The wrapper was just paper, faded and fragile with age. But what it represented, the abundance, the casual generosity, the stubborn insistence on treating enemies as human beings, that was stronger than any weapon, more enduring than any military victory. It was the quiet triumph of one ideology over another, one not in grand battles but in 10,000 small moments of unexpected kindness. It was proof that even in the darkest circumstances, even in total war, the way you treat people reveals what you are fighting for. And if what you are fighting for is genuinely better than what your enemies offer, then that difference will be visible in the smallest details. In a chocolate bar, in a clean bandage, in a cup of cold water offered to someone who expected death. The war ended. The empire fell. The prisoners went home. But the memory of that difference remained, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of treating human beings as human beings even when every circumstance suggested you should do otherwise. That was the lesson learned in the caves of Okinawa, in the POW camps, in the moment when ideology collided with reality and reality won. It was a lesson about power, not the power of weapons or wealth, but the power of a worldview that insists on human dignity even in the midst of hell. That power changed lives, changed minds, changed history. And it started with something as simple as a chocolate bar rolling into the darkness, offered by an enemy who should have been a demon but turned out to be just a young man who believed that even enemies deserved to be treated as human beings. That belief, stubborn, impractical, costly, and utterly revolutionary, was what American soldiers carried into battle. It was written in their training manuals, enforced by their officers, and embodied in their actions. It was what made the difference when Kimiko Tanaka's finger touched the grenade pin and then, impossibly, pulled away. It was what saved her life and the lives of thousands of others. And decades later, when she told her students about that moment in the cave, about the choice she almost made and the choice she eventually made instead, she would end with the same words. I expected demons. I found human beings. That difference saved my life. Remember it, honor it, live it, because that difference is what makes us free.